Common ground. Lawmakers seek a bipartisan response on police reform. We're on Capitol Hill. Federal discrimination laws. The Supreme Court issues a ruling on the firing of employees based on sexual orientation or self-determined gender identity. Transforming our lives. Pope Francis reminds the faithful of the power of the Eucharist. And the path to sainthood. We hear about a computer programming teenager who will be beatified in October. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, June 15th, 2020. Good evening, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. I'm Owen Jensen. Tracy is off. Nationwide protests continue weeks after the death of George Floyd, and over the weekend, more outcry in Atlanta. The shooting death of Rayshard Brooks during a police stop sparked more protests, and the Atlanta police chief has resigned. Correspondent Mark Irons has the latest around the country. Mark.
And Chief Erica Shields' resignation follows an incident that resulted in the death of Rayshard Brooks. Atlanta's mayor says deadly force was not justified. Tonight, police and surveillance camera footage is being used to piece together what happened.
Police body cam footage shows Rayshard Brooks had fallen asleep in a Wendy's restaurant drive-through line Friday night. Later, after failing a sobriety test, Brooks resisted arrest. In the ensuing scuffle, he managed to grab an officer's taser and fired it at an officer while running away. The officer then fatally shot Brooks. Atlanta's mayor weighed in.
I firmly believe that there is a clear distinction between what you can do and what you should do. I do not believe that this was a justified use of deadly force.
The officer was fired. Atlanta's police chief resigned, and following the incident outside Wendy's, police are looking for a woman suspected of burning down the restaurant.
Whole street, our street.
Protests continued throughout the city. The death of Brooks reignited nationwide demand for police reform initially sparked by the death of George Floyd. Floyd's brother is calling for change.
Everything that's going on, people just tired. Enough is enough. You constantly see people dying every day, black people dying.
Protests continued over the weekend, including an effort to block a major highway in the nation's capital. And in Seattle, after police evacuated the 3rd Precinct building, thousands of protesters continue to occupy city streets inside multiple blocks, calling it the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone.
The president has called Seattle protesters domestic terrorists and even threatened to use federal force if the state does not intervene. Owen?
Correspondent Mark Irons reporting tonight. Thank you very much, Mark. Well, President Donald Trump is set to announce executive actions on law enforcement as soon as Tuesday, tomorrow. Today, he tweeted law and order. Kellyanne Conway told reporters today the president is working around the clock on that executive order and that police need generous resources and our respect.
We have to make sure our communities and neighborhoods that they are charged to protect feel safe and feel included. I believe in justice and liberty for all.
Meanwhile, the president has been pushing for the economy to reopen. Coronavirus case numbers are still growing in states across the country and indeed nations around the world. White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow says health experts have told him this is not a second wave and they are not going to put on the economic brakes again.
I understand the market is jitterish about this, but I think this is going to turn out fine. We have no intention whatsoever of shutting down the economy.
The president's upcoming rally is in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where rally goers will have to sign a consent form in case they contract the illness so as not to sue. The president tweeted out that fake media is trying to shame him for holding a rally, but that it has no problem with the protests and riots. On Capitol Hill, police reform continues to take center stage as protests continue across the country. But at least one Republican senator says he's not sure there will ever be a law establishing use of force by police officers. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales has more. Eric.
Well, Owen, that senator is Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina. He is the only African-American Republican in the Senate. Now, he says to be able to establish a universal standard of use of force, that would be nearly impossible because there are so many different types of scenarios.
in the same way that we responded to the coronavirus. I'm hopeful that we'll respond to police reform.
Republican Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina says he believes a national use of force standard will be nearly impossible to implement. But he does see areas where House Democrats' Justice and Policing Act and the bill taking shape in the Senate under his leadership have common ground.
I think we both have the desire to see the chokehold used infinitely less. We take two different paths to get there, but that's one area. I think the duty to intervene is something that we have in our legislation, watching the 3 officers stand there while the other one was on Mr. Floyd's neck. That's something that we should work on.
The GOP plan also calls for police de-escalation training, use of force police oversight boards, and restrictions for police carrying out no-knock warrants. That has similarities with the proposal Democrats unveiled 1 week ago.
It will combat police brutality by requiring body and dashboard cameras, banning chokeholds, no-knock warrants in drug cases, and end racial profiling.
And today, Maryland's Catholic bishops issued a letter on racial justice stating, quote, "We must act to bring about true change. We continue to pray that the Holy Spirit will enlighten the minds and hearts of our elected representatives. U.S. lawmakers will need those prayers Wednesday, when the House Judiciary Committee will mark up their bill, and when Senate Republicans are expected to unveil their bill, each one aimed at eradicating police misconduct."
My experience with this fortunately did not lead to bodily harm, but the point is that this is something that is serious, that happens to African Americans all over the place.
Of course, any legislation will need to be approved by President Trump for his signature. Now, Senator Scott says that he is confident President Trump will do what's in the best interest, not only for African Americans, but also the entire nation. Owen?
Correspondent Eric Rosales reporting from Capitol Hill tonight. Thank you, Eric. Well, the Supreme Court has just ruled employers cannot fire workers because of their sexual orientation nor self-determined gender identity. The decision was based on the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which barred sexual discrimination in the workplace. Democrats applauded the 6-3 ruling. Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, said in a statement, quote, "Today, the Supreme Court has unequivocally affirmed that all Americans, regardless of who you are or whom you love, are protected from discrimination in the workplace under federal law." Joining us now is Carrie Severino, president of the Judicial Crisis Network and a former clerk for Justice Clarence Thomas. Carrie, welcome back to the show.
Good to be here.
I'll get right to it. So a 6-3 ruling, and that includes Neil Gorsuch and Roberts both voting with the 4 liberal members of the court. That surprise you?
Yeah, it's very discouraging, not just because I think this is an incorrect result in terms of the statute. That's not what the language of the 1964 statute meant, but because the opinion was written in a way that I would say is sort of a sham textualism. It claimed to be interpreting the original meaning of discrimination on the basis of sex, but it's obvious that's not what the law meant in 1964. For decades thereafter, it's very clear that the many states who have enacted protections for gender identity or sexual orientation discrimination have done so using those words. So not by calling it discrimination based on the sex. So it's frustrating to see the redefinition, and as Justice Alito put it in his dissent, the court acting as legislation pure and simple.
What does it mean for Catholic and other faith-based organizations, the ruling?
Well, this is something that Justice Alito also pointed out in his dissent. There are some real issues that will be brought before the court. I think a tsunami of litigations coming based on religious freedom questions like in Hobby Lobby, will religious employers be forced to cover transgender treatments or surgeries on their health care coverage? What does that mean for religious schools in terms of who they will be able to hire or will be required to hire individuals who go against their own church teachings? There are a lot of areas that still have to be determined by the court, even going down to what pronouns one may be able to use. You have areas already like New York City that are forbidding use of any pronouns that other than those determined by an individual. So all of those, the courts are now going to have to try to work through. And I think that's more indication that this is not something that's always been in the law. This is clearly a sea change in the law, and that's why we're going to see so much litigation going forward.
Yeah, one critic of the ruling wrote, this will create chaos and enormous unfairness for women and girls in athletics, women's shelters, etc.
Yeah, I think that's a real area, whether women's sports can continue if men are required to be allowed to participate in those same sports. Bathroom usage, locker room usage. The majority opinion didn't want to take these issues on and kind of just brushed over them, but we can't ignore the practical realities of what's going to come from this dramatic change in the law.
So employers with religious objections to employing LGBT, do they have any recourse tonight?
Well, there is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, obviously. There's the First Amendment that should protect churches and religious schools. But, there's a lot of attempts to narrow those protections as much as possible. We did see the court standing up for that in Hobby Lobby, but it's discouraging to see that there's yet another area that religious employers are now going to become embattled on here. So if you don't have courts that are willing to stand by the text of a statute, it makes us wonder then, are they going to stand by the text of the First Amendment of the Constitution as well?
Okay, well, it sounds like this isn't the final be-all, end-all, but is the court considering any other cases right now that you know of that might be of interest to the Catholic community?
Certainly. I mean, there's a major abortion case, the June medical decision, which has to do with holding abortion clinics to the same standards that other outpatient surgical centers are held to in Louisiana. We're expecting that to come down. The Espinoza case, which has to do with Blaine amendments, which were inaugurated really to stop public funding from being able to go to Catholic schools as part of an anti-Catholic initiative. We may see the opportunity for the court to finally end those discriminatory amendments for good. And then the Our Lady of Guadalupe school case is one that has to do with whether churches do have a religious exemption for being able to choose their own teachers to make sure the teachers are, in fact, in line with church teaching. The Supreme Court has already spoken on that, I thought pretty clearly, but the Ninth Circuit didn't seem to think so. So this may be the chance for the Supreme Court to go back and say, no, yes, religious schools really ought to have the ability to choose their own teachers. Otherwise, it undermines completely the message that they're trying to teach their students.
Appreciate your expertise as always. Carrie Severino, thank you very much. President of the Judicial Crisis Network. Check in with you later. Other news tonight, the presumed Democratic candidate for president, Joe Biden, got an endorsement from Planned Parenthood today, and the pro-life group Susan B. Anthony is responding in part, quote, Joe Biden has spent his entire campaign pandering to the radical abortion lobby. His endorsement by Planned Parenthood, the nation's largest abortion business, comes as no surprise. President Marjorie Dannenfelser continues, when Joe Biden flip-flopped on the Hyde Amendment, the Democratic Party's capitulation to extremism was complete. Coming up, the streets in some European cities were busier today than in recent weeks. And an unusual honor for President Donald Trump. We'll explain. Borders across Europe reopened this morning. Non-essential stores and restaurants have been closed for 3 months. Shop owners in London are welcoming the crowds.
Well, there's already queues at 6 a.m. this morning, so I think there's certainly some pent-up demand. But I think as the days come across, people are going to get used to coming back outside. That confidence to come out, spend time on the high street is really important.
There are long lines to get into shops, hand sanitizer is at the entrance, and one-way traffic signs to maintain social distancing.
L'Europa possa vedere come il vuoto che essa ha creato.
The mayor of an Italian town announces the reopening of the border with Slovenia. It's the first time traffic can cross from Italy since the middle of March. Road signs that banned traffic from crossing the border are being placed in Nova Gorica Museum so future generations can study this year's coronavirus pandemic. Latin America is quickly becoming the new hotspot for the coronavirus pandemic, with Brazil, Peru, and Chile having the highest number of confirmed cases. In Argentina, the new total number of cases nationwide is nearing 32,000. The area around the capital of Buenos Aires has the majority, with almost 28,000 cases and over 800 deaths. More protests around the world against racism over the weekend, from Britain to South Korea and Japan.
Fascistas! Fascistas! No pasarão!
Hundreds of protesters in Brazil rallied against racism and fascism in Sao Paulo. They also denounced President Bolsonaro. Protesters are angry at Brazil's policies related to racism and the coronavirus restrictions and are demanding an end to the lockdown. In London, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is creating an anti-racism panel to look at racial equality. Johnson says his panel will look at inequality in employment, academics, and access to health care. Over the weekend, hundreds of activists rallied in London saying they wanted to protect a statue of Winston Churchill, which was boarded up after protesters vandalized statues last week. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is asking a wealthy friend to help pay his multi-million-dollar legal bills. Last month, in a Jerusalem court, Netanyahu's trial on charges of fraud, breach of trust, and accepting bribes opened. The request for financial aid from a friend is not illegal. Netanyahu has said he is the victim of a witch hunt and called the bribery allegations baseless. Plans to build a Trump Heights neighborhood is on track in Israel's Golden Heights region. Prime Minister Netanyahu renamed the community as a gesture of appreciation for President Trump's recognition of Israel's sovereignty over the Heights. Stretch forth your hand to the poor. This is Pope Francis's chosen theme for this year's World Day of the Poor. It will be celebrated on November 15th. He calls on people to keep their gaze on the poor during the pandemic and not to succumb to a whirlwind of indifference. Pope Francis says the Eucharist heals our soul and unites us on the path to God.
E guarisce la nostra memoria ferita.
Celebrating the Feast of Corpus Christi in St. Peter's Basilica, the Holy Father said the Eucharist is not just a memory, but a reality. It heals our broken memories that form in our lives, bitterness, negativity, self-centeredness. With the Eucharist, it satisfies our hunger and kindles our desire to serve. Up next, new developments in allegations of religious persecution in China. And Pope Francis reminds the faithful of the power of the Eucharist. A recent report says in the first 4 months this year, China has removed crosses from more than 250 churches. An Italian magazine covering human rights issues in the communist country says the removals are part of a government crackdown on religion. And joining us now is Gary Bauer, Commissioner of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Gary, welcome back.
Thank you. I'm great to be with you as always.
And we were talking off camera. We don't realize how lucky we are in this country to worship freely, anywhere and any day of the week, anytime, without worrying about the government coming in and saying, get out of there. But in China, a much different story. What do we know about the crackdown taking place there?
Look, there's absolutely no doubt about this. China has declared, communist China, I want to emphasize, has declared war on all religious faiths. And that's certainly the case with Christianity. As you pointed out, they're ordering the taking down of crosses from churches because obviously those crosses are the most obvious sign of the Christian faith. But it goes even beyond that. 18-year-olds, people in China, Christians in China, 18 and younger, are now banned from participating in church services. There's an effort underway to take down paintings and representations of Jesus and the Virgin Mary and replace them with pictures of President Xi. I couldn't help but think of the irony here. Long after President Xi has been deposited in the trash can of history, Jesus and the Virgin Mary will still be influencing the lives of countless people around the world.
Another report last week said state-sponsored Catholic churches in the communist country would not be allowed to reopen during the pandemic unless they preached on patriotism. What do you know about this?
Well, patriotism, we tend to think of that as a very good thing, and it is a very good thing when you're living in a free country. But when you're living in a nation like communist China that is built on the idea that there is no God and that there is no loyalty that can be higher than loyalty to the state, well, when you're requiring Christians, Protestants, Catholics, if you're requiring any faith to embrace the idea that patriotism, Chinese style, trumps everything else, that's disgusting. That's clearly out of bounds. And you may have also heard about this. The government's also announced a plan to rewrite the Bible to make it more compatible with communism. just historically, it's worth pointing this out. The last powerful regime that tried that was Nazi Germany, and it didn't work out very well for them.
Recently you saw the executive order on advancing international religious freedom signed by President Trump. Will that have any impact in a country like China?
Well, look, obviously they're a powerful country and they're going to resist all of these things. But I really want to take my hat off to the President, to Vice President Pence, to Secretary of State Pompeo, because they have made this issue of religious liberty, both here at home, but in what we're talking about internationally, they have made it a major issue in American foreign policy, even going so far as to suggest that if you want American foreign aid, we're going to start looking at every country in the world to see whether they allow their citizens this basic human right of being able to seek God and worship God as your heart and soul leads you to do.
We don't know how lucky we are here, Gary. Absolutely. It's just, we're the greatest country in the world. We can worship when and where, however we want.
We should pray that we always have that liberty because there's always challenges to it.
Absolutely, as we've seen of recent. Gary Bauer, Commissioner of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, Pope Francis reminds the faithful our lives can be transformed by the body of Christ.
È Gesù presente che viene per nutrirci.
At his Sunday talk with pilgrims at the Vatican, the Holy Father said the Eucharist gives us energy to persevere after we have failed. He adds the best way to experience the body of Christ is to be united in love to those around us. And finally tonight, the Vatican has announced a date for the beatification of a computer programming teenager. It's a fascinating story. The young man died in 2006. Carlo Acutis will be beatified October 10th in Assisi, Italy. Carlo dedicated his time to researching Eucharistic miracles. He also created a website to share that information with others. The young man passed away of leukemia at the age of 15. Joining us now to tell us more about Carlo Acutis is Hannah Brockhouse, Senior Rome Correspondent for Catholic News Agency. Hannah, welcome back to the show. Great to see you.
Thanks, Owen.
So, Carlo Acutis, who was he? I know he's a young teen when he passed away, and what is the miracle attributed to him?
Well, the miracle that's been attributed to Carlo is the healing of a Brazilian child in 2013 from an anomaly of the pancreas.
Okay, and now he was, I did some research on him, fascinating young man, just devoted so much to Jesus. What is it about Carlo that people just really liked, really enjoyed being in his presence for?
Well, Carlo was known especially for his love of the Eucharist. Mm-hmm. That was something that he really devoted his life to, even his short life. From the time of his first Holy Communion, after that he attended daily Mass. He did Eucharistic adoration every day. He also prayed the rosary every day. And he was shocked to find out that his peers did not have this same appreciation for what the Eucharist was. So that was really, his mother told CNA in an interview, that was really the highlight, the center of his life was Jesus. But I think another thing that attracts people to Carlo is just the fact that he was a teen who lived relatively recently. Mm-hmm. He loved video games. He loved the computer. He was especially adept at computer programming, even from a really young age. His mother also said she had to buy him textbooks, like college textbooks on computer programming, that he taught himself how to program. But through all of that, his connection to the Lord meant that he was extremely also obedient. He loved the poor, and he even, self-moderated his use of video games, for example, holding that to just playing video games one time per week. Wow. I think those are just a few of the reasons that people are attracted to this young man.
I've got some teens. I don't think they can not play for more, video games for more than like 2 hours, right? Go without it. Is it rare for a teenager to be beatified?
Not so rare. We do have cases of also canonizations of teenagers throughout history, usually martyrs. I think as the church turns to beatifying and canonizing more and more lay people, I think that we're going to continue to see more young people who are being canonized and being beatified. Another example is Chiara Badano, also an Italian teenager who was born in the 1980s, and she's also now blessed. So I hope that we'll continue to see this. There's another Italian teen who has been declared venerable recently. So perhaps we'll see a trend continuing of at least knowing the lives of these other holy young people.
Yeah, it's really, really exciting to read about. And you know, I would suggest any young person out there, or anyone, should read about these teens who made such an impression on the world, just their short lives. Hannah Brockhouse, thank you very much, our senior Rome correspondent for Catholic News Agency. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Owen Jensen. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night. God bless.